The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Margaret Walsh clocks in at 6:48 a.m., 14 minutes before her shift officially begins, because the night shift always leaves two patients waiting, and she has learned that arriving early is the difference between a manageable morning and a crisis. She doesn't look at the schedule board. She doesn't need to. After 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial, her body knows the rhythms of Norfolk's oldest emergency department the way a sailor knows the feel of a ship's deck, by muscle memory, by the 1,000 small adjustments that no one taught her and no one notices. The ER smells like what it always smells like, antiseptic and burnt coffee, and something underneath that, something organic and difficult, the smell of bodies in distress. Margaret moves through the pre-shift routine with economical precision. She ties her dark blue scrubs tight at the waist. She checks her watch, a simple Timex, nothing that draws attention. She pulls on her long-sleeved white jacket despite the fact that the ER temperature sits at 72 degrees and will climb to 80 by noon. The jacket is part of the architecture of her invisibility. No one sees the scars on her forearms. That is exactly the way Margaret prefers it. She walks past the break room where 3 night shift nurses are eating cardboard sandwiches and scrolling through phones with the glazed expressions of people who have stopped processing what they see hours ago. One of them, Denise, looks up and opens her mouth to wave Margaret over. Margaret doesn't slow her pace. She simply nods once, the kind of nod that says I am acknowledging your existence as a courtesy, and moves into the main ER corridor. Denise's hand falls. She will try again tomorrow and the day after. She tries every shift, the way some people try to pet a wild animal that makes it very clear it prefers solitude. The morning light filters through the ER entrance doors, pale and weak, the color of watered-down milk. A patient in Bay 3 is crying, not in pain, Margaret notes, but in the particular way that suggests dehydration and confusion, probably an elderly man who came in at 2 a.m. with his daughter and has now been awake long enough to forget why he was brought here. His daughter sits beside him scrolling her own phone, and Margaret makes a mental note to check his hydration status and maybe suggest a sitting position change in 10 minutes. These small interventions are what younger nurses miss. They look at the monitor and read the numbers. Margaret looks at the person and reads the deterioration before it becomes visible in numbers. She settles into the supply station, the one with the broken stool that she prefers because no one else will sit there, and begins the ritual. She counts for catheters in sizes she will need most: 18 gauge, 20 gauge, 22 gauge. She checks that the 14 gauge needles are where she expects them, because a patient with a tension pneumothorax will require speed, and the slightest fraction of a second matters when lungs are collapsing. She organizes her trauma shears, her penlight, her stethoscope. These are not the shears with her call sign engraved on the handle. Those shears are still in a box in a storage unit in Chesapeake, along with a uniform she will never wear again and a photograph of 7 men in desert gear, faces burned dark by a sun that no longer feels real. The faded unit patch is in her locker, sewn into the lining of her jacket. She touches it before each shift, a ritual so brief that a camera would miss it. Her fingers find the spot where the cloth has worn thin, where her thumb has worn thin, and she breathes in the way she learned to breathe when time mattered, when panic was luxury and composure was survival. In through the nose for a count of 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The breathing centers her in ways that yoga videos on television could never accomplish. At 7:04 a.m., Dr. Sebastian Sterling enters the ER for the first time as its new director. He is a man built from money the way other men are built from muscle. His white coat is monogrammed on the left side, SES in lettering that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, and he walks with the particular confidence that comes from knowing that his family's donation of $7.3 million built the hospital's West Wing. The West Wing is where the rich people go when they get sick. The ER is where everyone else comes to fall apart. Sterling is 51 years old, according to the bio the administration circulated last week. He has a practiced smile that appears when senior staff approach and vanishes when he thinks no one is watching. His shoes are Italian leather. His watch is a brand that Margaret has heard mentioned in contexts where people were discussing status. His jaw suggests that his dentist is very, very expensive. He pauses in the doorway of the ER and surveys the space like a general surveying a battlefield. His eyes catalogue the rooms, the staff, the equipment. Margaret watches him work, not directly, but in the way that a person skilled in observation can track movement in her peripheral vision without appearing to track anything at all. Sterling's gaze passes over the charge nurse, Brenda, who has worked in this ER for 18 years and knows every patient, every doctor, every possible complication before it occurs. His eyes register her competence and then move on. His gaze passes over Michael, the trauma tech who can move a 290-pound patient on a backboard alone and do it with the gentleness of someone handling something irreplaceable. Sterling nods at Michael. Michael is young and male and built like someone who plays college football, which he did, and that registers as useful in Dr. Sterling's rapidly calculated taxonomy of value. When Sterling's gaze reaches Margaret, it stops for approximately 2.3 seconds. She sees him see her, a woman in her mid-50s, hair pulled back in a severe style that makes no effort toward aesthetics, wearing a long-sleeved jacket in summer. A nurse who hasn't been promoted in the 3 years she's worked here. A nurse whose name he will not immediately know. A nurse who stands at the supply station in a hospital that his family's money built, and therefore a nurse who exists in the infrastructure, not in the visible hierarchy. His eyes move on. Margaret has been seen and dismissed so many times in 3 years that she has almost forgotten what it feels like to be truly seen. Almost. There are some things you don't forget, even when you're trying very hard to become someone who would forget them. She finishes organizing her trauma shears and stands with the kind of posture that suggests she has nothing to offer and nowhere important to go. Her spine is straight, old habit, impossible to break, the kind of habit that 17 years of discipline builds into your skeleton, but she keeps her eyes down. Eyes down is part of the invisibility. Eyes down says I am not a threat, I am not watching you, I am beneath your notice. She moves into the main ER corridor and begins her rounds. The morning shifts into its rhythm. A patient with a kidney stone screams in Bay 2. A patient with chest pain that turns out to be severe anxiety enters Bay 4. A woman in her 70s with a fall from her living room step comes in with a gashed forehead and no serious injuries, though she will require several stitches and repeated reassurances that she will be fine. Margaret moves between these people with the kind of efficiency that comes from knowing exactly what to do without needing to think about it. She adjusts an IV drip by 10 milliliters without being asked, seeing that the patient's veins are fragile and the flow rate is too fast. A resident notices later and corrects the drip back, and Margaret doesn't say anything. She adjusts it again when he leaves. She positions the kidney stone patient so that his body is supported in a way that his muscles aren't contracting against his own weight, reducing spasm intensity without medication. She notices, before anyone else notices, that the chest pain patient's oxygen saturation is dropping, not because of his heart but because his anxiety is making him hyperventilate, and she sits beside him and breathes in a measured pattern until his breathing matches hers and his numbers climb back to normal. No one thanks her for these things. No one attributes these improvements to Margaret. The resident assumes he was wrong about the flow rate. The chest pain patient assumes his anxiety got better because the waiting was less scary. The kidney stone patient assumes the hospital's positioning standards are good. This is how Margaret works. This is how she has learned to work. Invisible, efficient, essential, and never, ever mentioned. At 11:48 a.m., a man enters the ER in a hospital ID that indicates he is visiting from the 75th Ranger Regiment's Medical Support Unit. His name is Captain James Holloway, and he is here to review training protocols and coordinate with the trauma team about casualty evacuation procedures. He is 43 years old, lean in the way that comes from running distances that would make ordinary people weep, and his eyes have the particular quality of someone who has seen things that made him understand the difference between problems and crises. Holloway is introduced to Sterling by the hospital's chief of medicine. Sterling shakes his hand with the same practiced confidence he uses with everyone. "We're honored to have the 75th Ranger Regiment support our training," Sterling says, and the words are correct but the tone is slightly too loud, slightly too much, the way a man speaks when he wants everyone in the room to know that he is shaking hands with someone important. Holloway nods politely. His eyes scanned the ER with the same assessing quality that Sterling used, but where Sterling was cataloging status and hierarchy, Holloway is cataloging competence and readiness. He is looking for the people who would function correctly in chaos. He is looking for the people who would not panic when a Black Hawk landed on the roof carrying 8 soldiers with wounds that looked like they had been caused by an IED rather than ordinary accident. The room went dead silent when Holloway entered, though Margaret is probably the only person who noticed that it went silent. No, that's not accurate. Captain Holloway noticed. She can see it in the way his eyes pause on the supply station for a moment longer than anywhere else, taking in the organization, the precision, the systems that suggest someone very efficient has arranged things according to priorities. Margaret is checking a patient's peripheral for access when Holloway passes her station. She doesn't look up. She doesn't need to. But she is aware of him the way a person becomes aware of a room shifting its pressure, an invisible change in the air molecules that precede sound. He pauses. The morning rhythm of the ER continues around them, monitors beeping in their constant arrhythmic chorus, a patient being called to radiology, the squeak of a stretcher rolling toward intake. Margaret finishes checking the site is clean, no swelling, good placement, and moves to the next task, continuing her work as though nothing has changed, as though the presence of a ranger officer has not just created a moment of profound significance that no one else will understand. But that wasn't the worst part of Holloway's arrival, and Margaret would understand this immediately if she allowed herself to. What happened next changed everything. 3 days into Dr. Sterling's tenure at Oak Creek Memorial, Margaret Walsh entered room for 12 with a medication cup and a measured breath. The patient inside was 84 years old, post-surgical, with a chart that read like a textbook in complications. Most notably, a flag in red, prior respiratory depression at 5 milligrams of morphine. The patient's daughter and son sat in vinyl chairs flanking the bed, holding vigil over their father's sleeping form. Dr. Sterling stood at the bedside writing in the chart. Margaret saw the order before he finished the second digit, 10 milligrams. Her jaw tightened. She waited for him to look up, for acknowledgement, for any opening to speak. He didn't offer one. She stepped closer anyway, her voice pitched low enough that only he and the family could hear. Dr. Sterling, perhaps we should review the patient history before administering. The note from last year indicates. He cut her off without lifting his pen from the paper. Nurse Walsh, when I need a 50-year-old floor nurse to practice medicine for me, I'll ask. Until then, stay in your lane. The words landed exactly as intended. The patient's daughter flinched. The son's shoulders tensed. Margaret took one measured breath through her nose. Her spine straightened. She did not look away. The patient stopped breathing on 7 milligrams last year, doctor. It's documented. Sterling set down his pen. He leaned close enough that only she and the family could hear, his voice smooth as oil poured over stone. Write it up as a formal concern if you're so worried, Granny. Otherwise, administer what I ordered or I'll find someone who follows instructions. He smiled at the daughter. Your father is in good hands. A single tear escaped Margaret's left eye, not from sadness, but from the pressure of holding everything still inside her chest. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. My record speaks for itself, doctor. She changed the order herself, documented the override in the system, and signed her name next to the intervention. Then she administered 5 milligrams of morphine as the prior protocol demanded. The patient slept through the night without incident. By morning, Sterling had filed a complaint about the medication change. By noon, everyone knew. The break room the next day was a study in choreographed absence. Margaret entered with her lunch, a turkey sandwich in a container, an apple, a bottle of water, and 4 nurses sat at the main table in mid-conversation. They saw her. Their eyes found each other like magnets seeking north. Within 30 seconds, all 4 had discovered urgent reasons to leave. One checked her phone and gasped at a text that didn't exist. Another suddenly remembered a patient who needed vitals. The third found a call she had to make. The 4th simply stood and walked out, trailing some murmur about supply inventory. This repeated every day for the next 6 days. Margaret sat alone at that table, her hands perfectly still around her sandwich, staring at nothing. She ate with the mechanical precision of someone refueling a machine. Other staff members began timing their breaks to avoid overlapping with hers. The supply closet became a refuge. The bathroom stall became a sanctuary. By day 4, Margaret stopped coming to the break room entirely. She ate in her car in the parking lot, watching the rain streak the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it might escape. The public humiliation came on a Tuesday during the 3 p.m. shift change. Sterling posted a formal disciplinary notice on the unit board, the bulletin board where staffing schedules and safety announcements lived, positioned at eye level where everyone would see it on their way in or out. He printed it in bold letters. He printed it on hospital letterhead. Then he read it aloud to the assembled staff, his voice carrying the tone of a teacher addressing students who'd disappointed him. Effective immediately, he began, the following incidents have been documented and filed. Insubordination. Unauthorized medication changes. Failure to respect physician authority. Some people seem to believe that experience, he paused, his eyes finding Margaret across the room, does not equal expertise. They believe their years at this hospital somehow qualify them to override medical decisions. They don't. 12 staff members stood frozen. Margaret stood perfectly still, that same measured breath moving through her chest, her eyes forward. Sterling continued, his voice taking on the theatrical weight of a man who knew he had his audience. This behavior will not be tolerated. Documentation is attached. Any further instances will result in immediate suspension and review for termination. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was clear as surgical steel. I prevented a respiratory arrest, doctor. The family can confirm. Sterling smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and kept going, turning them cold. The family can confirm you undermined their trust in my care. You questioned my judgment in front of them. That's the behavior we're addressing. He turned to address the room. We're a team here. Teams require trust. And trust requires following the chain of command. The notice remained on the board for a week before Sterling had it removed, not out of mercy, but because he'd made his point. By then, the damage had metastasized through the ER like an infection. Margaret had become the unit's cautionary tale. The nurse who'd overstepped. The older staff member who couldn't adapt to new leadership. The insubordinate who thought her judgment mattered more than orders. Nobody knew that she'd saved the patient's life. Then Thursday arrived with sirens and chaos. A construction accident at the port of Norfolk sent 3 workers to Oak Creek Memorial, 1 critical with a penetrating chest wound and visible metal fragments embedded in the anterior left thorax. The trauma alert went out in the overhead code, not words, but a rhythm that every doctor and nurse in the hospital recognized as a ticking clock. 2 of the available trauma nurses had called in sick that morning. The 3rd was occupied with a sepsis protocol downstairs. Margaret was the one who took the lead bay, not because Sterling assigned it to her, but because she was standing closest to the ambulance entrance when the stretcher rolled through. She moved without asking permission. The patient was a man in his 50s, conscious but deteriorating fast. His left chest wall showed the classic signs, hyperresonance to percussion, diminished breath sounds, neck veins distending like cables. Tension pneumothorax. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time, 98 becoming 95 becoming 88 becoming something that looked like a free fall. Margaret's hands didn't hesitate. She prepped the site, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy as familiar to her as her own breathing. The 14-gauge needle felt like home between her fingers. She angled it 45 degrees above the rib, felt for the pop of the pleural space, and drove it home with the kind of confidence that comes from having done something 1,000 times before in the kinds of places where you never get to do it again if you do it wrong. The hiss of air escaped like a held breath finally released. The man's vitals stabilized within 90 seconds. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88, then 92, then 97. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 106. His blood pressure steadied. She secured the catheter with tactical efficiency and was already assembling the supplies for the next intervention when Dr. Sterling walked through the trauma bay doors, took one look at the now stable patient, and said absolutely nothing to her. A voice spoke from behind her shoulder. "Where do you serve?" Margaret's hands froze for half a second. She turned. The man was military. You could read it in the way he stood, the way his eyes tracked movement, the particular quality of stillness that comes from having learned to survive in places where movement could kill you. He wore civilian clothes, but beneath them lived the architecture of someone who'd been molded by discipline. "I didn't," Margaret said, turning back to her work. "Nobody moves like that without representatives downrange," the man pressed. His voice held the tone of someone stating a fact, not asking a question. "Helmand? Kandahar." Margaret's eyes met his with a look that ended conversations. It was the look of someone who'd learned long ago that certain doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. "You're mistaken." He nodded slowly, unconvinced but understanding the perimeter he'd just hit. He backed away, giving her space. As he returned to whatever task had brought him to Oak Creek Memorial that day, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a stone rolling, a door creaking, the weight of invisibility pressing harder against her shoulders. That night, Margaret stood in her apartment in front of the mantel. A photograph lived there in a silver frame, a Navy SEAL in dress uniform, shoulders back, eyes forward, the image of a man who'd learned how to carry impossible weight. Her husband. Killed in action, Helmand Province, 2018. Officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had died there alongside him. Officially, the woman standing in Norfolk didn't exist. She reached out and touched the glass. "I'm staying quiet," she whispered. "Like we agreed. I won't surface again." But the medic had seen. And seeing, once it began, was only going to spread. The doors exploded inward at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday. A 300-pound man with eyes the color of shattered glass stormed through the entrance, veins bulging at his temples like cords threatening to snap. His skin glistened with sweat. His mouth opened and closed without rhythm, screaming words that weren't quite words, a sound like something animal trying to speak human language. PCP. The telltale signs were written across his face, across the way his fists clenched and unclenched as if his hands belonged to someone else. He swung a tire iron. The triage desk exploded into splinters. The intake nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Oak Creek for 6 years, dove backward and hit the wall hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. The tire iron punched through her computer monitor with a sound like a gunshot, sparks cascading down like fireworks in a burning building. "Get away from me. They're in the walls. They're in the walls." His voice was a roar. His presence had the force of something physical, pressing down on the air itself. Patients in the waiting room scattered like startled birds. A woman in a neck brace stumbled toward the exit. An elderly man abandoned his walker. A security guard, Danny, reached for his radio mounted on his shoulder, but the 300-pound man turned and charged him with the tire iron raised overhead. Danny ran. He ran fast, disappearing down the east corridor toward the medication dispensing area. Dr. Sterling, the new ER director with the confidence of a man who'd bought his position rather than earned it, backed into the medication room and locked the door behind him. His hands were shaking as he twisted the deadbolt. Through the small square window, Margaret could see his face, pale, shocked, the look of someone who'd just discovered that a title and a paycheck didn't translate to courage when the rubber met the road. Nurses scattered. 2 respiratory therapists pulled a patient's footpole and ran. A medical assistant dropped the stack of charts she'd been carrying. The papers scattered across the floor like snow. Everyone moved toward the exits, away from the man with the tire iron, away from the wildness in his eyes. Margaret Walsh, standing 20 feet from the entrance near the supply station where she'd been restocking trauma shears, set down her chart without hurrying. She didn't run. She didn't step back. She didn't freeze. She walked directly toward him. Her hands rose slowly, palms forward, arms slightly away from her body, a posture that said compliance, that said no threat. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the way someone moves when they've learned that sudden motion gets people killed. Her voice, when it came, dropped to a register that shouldn't have carried through the chaos, but it did. It was the voice of someone who'd learned to command without shouting, to project authority through presence alone. "Brother! Look at me! Just me!" She kept walking, closing the distance between them. The man's eye snapped to hers, the tire iron wavering but still raised. His breathing was ragged, animal, the sound of lungs working too hard, too fast. "You're safe here." Her voice remained steady, neither fearful nor aggressive. "Nobody's in the walls. There's nobody in the walls. You're safe." Her eyes never left his face. She was reading him the way a combat medic reads a wounded soldier, taking in the pupil dilation, the muscular tension, the angle of his shoulders, understanding what his body was telling her before his conscious mind could form words. The tire iron trembled. 10 feet away now. 8 feet. The man made a sound like a growl, like an animal caught in a trap. "Put it down easy." Her voice had shifted, still calm, still low, but now carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're in control here. Show me you're in control. Put it down." 6 feet. Margaret shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, her center of gravity dropping a fraction of an inch. The kind of micro-adjustment that soldiers make without thinking, muscle memory encoded through 20 years of combat training, through scenarios in Kandahar where one wrong placement of weight meant the difference between disarming an opponent and taking a round to the chest. 4 feet. The man screamed, a sound like something breaking, and swung the tire iron in a wide, desperate arc aimed at her head. Margaret moved inside the swing before the iron completed its motion. Her left hand struck a pressure point below his elbow with the precision of someone who'd performed this technique on living targets, not dummies. The nerve cluster responded exactly as trained, his grip weakened. Her right hand secured his wrist, twisting it in a small, controlled motion that rotated his arm and shoulder. His own momentum, his own weight, his own strength became the tool of his own restraint. He was face down on the tile floor in 2.3 seconds. The tire iron clattered away, spinning across the polished surface. Margaret had her knee positioned precisely on his spine, her weight distributed to restrict movement without cutting off blood flow to his lower extremities. Her hands were still visible, still controlled, holding him with textbook restraint positioning, the kind taught in advanced military medical courses, not civilian nursing schools. "You're okay." Her voice remained calm, as if she'd just guided someone through a difficult but routine procedure. "We've got you. You're safe now." Security arrived 60 seconds later, rushing through the scattered patients and overturned furniture. They found the threat neutralized. They found a 300-pound man who'd been certain 10 seconds earlier that he could tear through anyone in this hospital, now lying still on cold tile, breathing hard but breathing, no injuries except to his pride. They found Margaret standing, her scrubs barely rumpled, her breathing controlled, her pulse probably still below 90 beats per minute. Dr. Sterling emerged from the medication room. The deadbolt clicked open. He stepped out slowly, cautiously, as if checking whether the danger had truly passed. His eyes moved across the scene, the destroyed triage desk, the shattered computer monitor, the scattered papers, the patient in the wheelchair overturned near the imaging station, and then they landed on Margaret. He stared. Not with gratitude. Not with respect. With something else entirely. Something that looked like recognition, but the wrong kind. The kind of recognition that came when a man realized he'd misjudged the person in front of him, and that realization felt like a threat. That night, from his office with the door locked and the lights dimmed, Dr. Sterling made 4 phone calls. The first was to board member Richard Hayes, a man with family connections deeper than Sterling's own and a willingness to solve problems quietly. "We may have a situation with one of the nursing staff," Sterling said. "I need discretion." The second was to HR. "I want a full personnel audit on Margaret Walsh. Employment history, references, the works. I need it done quietly, and I need it fast." The third was to an investigator he'd used before, a man named Crawford who specialized in background verification and asked very few questions. There's a nurse here with gaps in her employment record. I need to know what those gaps are. The fourth was to the head of the nursing board at the university where Margaret claimed to have completed her licensure. The conversation was brief. I have questions about one of your graduates from the early 2000s. Margaret Walsh. Can you confirm her enrollment? None of the calls were documented in the official record. None of them went through the hospital's proper channels. But then again, Dr. Sterling had never been a man who preferred proper channels. Proper channels required accountability. Proper channels left a trail. By midnight, he had confirmation Margaret's employment record had gaps. Significant gaps. Years where she'd simply disappeared from the civilian nursing world. Years with no explanation, no forwarding address, no references to contact. The more he dug, the more those gaps bothered him. The more they looked less like unexplained absences and more like deliberate erasure. And the more he dug, the more Sterling realized he'd been humiliated by someone he should have been able to destroy, and that humiliation was going to require consequences. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that everyone had seen it. Everyone in Oak Creek Memorial had watched Margaret Walsh calmly approach a man who'd terrified them, who'd sent them running, who'd made them question whether they'd chosen the right profession. They'd watched her disarm him without injury. They'd watched her maintain composure while they'd scattered like frightened animals. And now they knew something that Margaret had spent 3 years hiding. She was not the invisible aging nurse they'd treated as background noise. She was something else entirely. Muscle memory had taken over in those for seconds. Her hands had moved on their own, guided by 20 years of training, by scenarios in the mountains of Helmand Province where letting someone land a blow meant dying in the dust with your name never making it home. Her voice had carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding soldiers, not comforting patients. She'd revealed herself, and there was no putting that back in the box. That night, Margaret sat in the break room by herself. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic song overhead. The coffee maker gurgled, cycling through its evening self-cleaning program. She'd removed her blooded scrubs and changed into fresh ones, but the adrenaline was still moving through her system, still making her hands feel slightly disconnected from the rest of her body. Captain Holloway from the 75th Ranger Regiment had left a message on the hospital's voicemail. Just his name. Just a request that she call him back. Just enough to let her know that the medic had talked, that word was spreading, that her anonymity had an expiration date and that date was probably sometime in the next 72 hours. She'd been buried once before. She died in Helmand Province, officially listed as deceased, her name removed from every database except the ones that mattered, the ones that existed only in classified files and in the memories of the 18 soldiers she'd served alongside. She'd been given a new name, a new social security number, a new birth certificate created so carefully that it had survived 3 years of investigation without cracking. But you could only disappear so many times. The next morning, Dr. Sterling would begin making additional calls. Dr. Sterling made his first call at 6:08 a.m., before the administrative offices opened, while the hospital was still breathing easy between night shift and morning chaos. He sat in his corner office, the one with the mahogany desk and the view of the parking lot that cost $40,000 to arrange, and pulled up his contact list. 3 names. 3 board members. 3 people who'd helped him secure this position through family connections and country club handshakes. He dialed the first number. Richard, it's Sebastian Sterling. Yes, from Oak Creek. I need to discuss a personnel matter with you. A nurse on my ER staff demonstrated tactical combat training during an incident yesterday. Pressure point takedowns. Military-grade de-escalation. I'm concerned she may have falsified her employment history. The pause on the other end was brief. Sterling knew how to plant seeds that grew into trees. I've already contacted an outside investigator. Just wanted the board aware. This is a liability issue, potentially a security issue. We need to know who we've hired. The second call came at 7:15. The third at 7:33. Each conversation was nearly identical. Each one framed Margaret Walsh not as a hero but as a threat. A security risk. Someone hiding something. Someone who demonstrated unexplained military capabilities without proper authorization or documentation. The language was precise. Careful. The kind of language that didn't accuse directly but created sufficient doubt to justify investigation. By 8 a.m., all 3 board members had promised to look into the matter. Then Sterling made the calls that would damage Margaret irreparably. Nursing school. Online database. 3 years of careful work to construct a civilian identity. Margaret Walsh had attended Portland State's evening RN program from 2016 to 2019, graduating with honors, references from 2 instructors, 1 clinical supervisor. Flawless records. Except the references were Navy personnel who'd been debriefed on what to say, who operated under the understanding that any variation from the script would trigger federal investigation. The clinical supervisor was a retired Special Forces medic operating under a cover identity provided by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Everything was airtight. Everything was a lie designed to hold exactly until it didn't need to hold anymore. Sterling's investigator was named Michaels, a former FBI background check specialist who now ran a private firm called Threshold Investigations. He was thorough. He was professional. He was also someone who'd been paid $75,000 upfront with another $75,000 pending completion of his report. Michaels didn't ask why a hospital administrator was so interested in a single nurse's employment history. He didn't ask why Sterling was willing to pay double his standard rate for expedited results. Michaels simply took the assignment and began pulling threads. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was working the Thursday evening shift, moving through the ER with the same careful invisibility she'd maintained for 3 years. 2 lacerations. 1 respiratory infection. 1 elderly patient with chest pain who needed monitoring but stabilized well. She moved between rooms with a kind of efficiency that made her invisible, not ignored, but unseen. Unremarkable. The way she'd trained herself to be. The way she'd stayed alive. It was 11:42 p.m. when the call came. Security escorted her to Dr. Sterling's office. HR was already there. A woman named Patricia Chen, the hospital's human resources director, sat across the desk with a file folder positioned between her hands like a weapon. Sterling smiled when Margaret entered. The smile of a man who'd found a way to weaponize the rules. "Margaret, sit down," Sterling said. His voice was pleasant. The voice of someone who'd already won. "We've had some concerns brought to our attention regarding your background. Some inconsistencies in your employment history." Margaret Saturday. Her back straight. Her hands folded in her lap. The same posture she'd held in 100 debriefs, 1,000 interrogations, across 4 continents and a lifetime of training. Ms. Chen reached out to Portland State. Sterling continued. "Your nursing school references seem to have unclear availability. 1 instructor is retired and living abroad. The clinical supervisor you listed no longer maintains contact information. And your employment history from 2014 to 2016 appears to have significant gaps." Margaret's voice was level. The voice of a woman who'd learned to separate body from emotion. "I explained those gaps during my hiring interview. I was caring for my husband. He passed in 2018. The gaps are documented in my initial paperwork." Patricia Chen opened the folder. "Your file shows a David Walsh listed as your emergency contact. The address listed matches a property in Virginia. That's consistent with Navy personnel. However, when we attempted to verify your work history prior to nursing school, I worked in healthcare administration," Margaret said quietly. "Private consulting. The company is no longer in operation." "That company," Patricia said, consulting her notes, "appears to have been a government contractor. Records are sealed. When we contacted the point of contact you listed, the phone number is no longer valid. The address doesn't exist." Sterling leaned back in his chair. His fingers formed a steeple beneath his chin. Margaret, we're not trying to be difficult here. But when a staff member demonstrates advanced tactical training, pressure point control that would require military instruction, and when her background history contains classified employment gaps and unavailable references, the board has a responsibility to ask questions. Margaret's jaw tightened. 1 millimeter. Invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to watch for it. I did what I was trained to do. I helped a patient who was in crisis. You did something considerably more sophisticated than basic de-escalation, Sterling said. Our security team has been in law enforcement for an average of 18 years each. They described what you did as a professional tactical takedown. That's not a skill you learn in a nursing program, Margaret. The silence stretched. Margaret was calculating. Running scenarios. Assessing options. Each one led to the same conclusion: she couldn't explain the truth without confirming everything Sterling suspected. She couldn't produce the documents that would clear her because those documents were classified at levels that required Pentagon sign-off. She couldn't call her handler because her handler had been dead for 4 years. She couldn't do anything except sit in this chair and watch her carefully constructed life collapse under the weight of a man who decided to destroy her because she'd corrected his medication order. Effective immediately, Patricia Chen said, sliding a document across the desk, "You're being placed on suspension pending investigation into your employment eligibility and credential verification. Your badge is being deactivated. Your locker will be sealed. Security will escort you out of the building." Margaret looked at the suspension letter. The language was clinical. Professional. Devastating. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about people like Margaret, their hands never shook. That was what made them useful in situations where other people fell apart. That was also what made them dangerous when they finally stopped being useful. "I've done nothing wrong," Margaret said. "Then the investigation will clear you," Sterling said, and smiled again. The smile of someone who knew the truth was irrelevant. The smile of someone who'd already won. Security walked her out at 12:17 a.m. 2 officers who'd worked with her for 3 years, who'd watched her treat injured officers with dignity and precision, who now wouldn't meet her eyes as they escorted her through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial. Her locker was opened. Her belongings, a change of scrubs, a water bottle, a photograph of David in his dress uniform, were placed in a hospital-issue plastic bag. Her badge was removed from her neck. The access code that had defined her 3 years of existence was revoked with a keystroke. She drove home in the rain. The rain came down like judgment, heavy and relentless, drumming against the windshield of her 12-year-old Subaru as she drove through Norfolk at 1 in the morning with nowhere to go but somewhere to go. She didn't drive home to her apartment in the Ghent neighborhood. She drove instead to Riverside Cemetery, where the plot stood in neat rows like soldiers waiting for inspection. She knew the way without GPS. She'd made this drive 47 times in 3 years. The headstone was dark granite. The rain made it shine like oil. Lieutenant Commander David Walsh, Navy SEAL. 1978 to 2018. Beloved husband and brother. She knelt beside it in the mud, rain soaking through her jacket, rain mixing with the tears that came whether she wanted them or not. Her hands weren't steady anymore. Her hands were shaking. "I failed you," she said to the stone, to the body beneath it, to the ghost of the man she'd loved more than oxygen. "I surfaced. I cared too much. I couldn't just hide the way I was supposed to." The rain drummed. Thunder rolled across the city like artillery. She pressed her forehead against the wet granite. "We died so this could work, David. We died so I could disappear and be nothing and matter to no one, and the whole thing was supposed to be invisible. It was supposed to be perfect. And I ruined it. I saved people and I couldn't keep my mouth shut and I ruined everything." She was sobbing now, the kind of deep broken sound that comes from somewhere beneath training, beneath composure, beneath the carefully constructed architecture of survival. She'd held wounded soldiers while their blood soaked into her sleeves. She performed emergency surgery on a concrete floor with insurgent fire crackling overhead. She'd talked down a Taliban commander who had a rifle pressed against her throat. She'd done all of that without breaking. But this quiet humiliation at the hands of a man in a $1,000 suit, broke something that couldn't be repaired with gauze and pressure and the kind of discipline that carried you through 17 hours of continuous combat medicine. She stayed there for an hour. 60 minutes. 3,600 seconds. The rain never stopped. Neither did she. When she finally stood, her legs were numb from kneeling in the mud. Her jacket was soaked through. Her face was red. Her eyes were swollen. But her spine was still straight. That part never broke. That part was welded shut with 42 years of military discipline and 3 years of careful invisibility. She drove home at 2:33 a.m. The apartment was dark and cold and exactly as she'd left it, sparse, functional, impersonal. A place where someone lived who wasn't planning to stay. She hung her wet jacket on the back of a chair. She didn't hang it to dry. She hung it the way someone hangs a flag at half-mast. The suspension letter sat on her kitchen counter all day Friday. She didn't open it again. She didn't call anyone. She didn't contact her lawyer, because a civilian lawyer would ask questions about her background that she couldn't answer. She didn't call her son, because her son didn't know, and if her son found out, he would try to help, and if he tried to help, it would only drag him down into the same hole she was falling through. She spent Friday staring out the window at Norfolk rain. She spent Friday calculating how long her savings would last. 9 months. Maybe 10 if she was careful. She spent Friday understanding that her careful life was over, that the ghost the Navy had created was about to be discovered, and that nothing she did in the next 72 hours would change anything. Then Monday came. Oak Creek Memorial called. A multi-vehicle accident on I-64 had overwhelmed the ER. They needed surge staffing. Margaret's suspension didn't prevent her from being called back for emergency coverage. She could work while her investigation was pending. She could work while Sterling tried to destroy her. She arrived at 3:15 p.m. in borrowed scrubs, no badge, shadowed by a supervisor who'd been instructed to monitor her. Her body moved through the ER like muscle memory returning. 2 hours of organized chaos. Lacerations and contusions and minor fractures. She was useful again. She was invisible again. She was putting people back together with hands that had never shaken, not in combat, not in crisis, but that were shaking now from rage she couldn't express and grief she couldn't explain. At 4:17 p.m., an ambulance arrived. Male patient, unconscious, brought in from the accident. Margaret helped transfer him to the trauma bay. She was reaching for the vitals monitor when she saw his face and everything stopped. She knew him. His name was Rashid Khan. Taliban commander. 3rd Battalion, Anda District. Captured during a night raid in 2017, just outside Kandahar, during Operation Mountain Shadow. Margaret had been the medic on that raid. She'd treated him for a shoulder wound with the same precise efficiency she treated everyone, enemy, ally, civilian. He'd been transferred to a detention facility. He'd eventually been released. He was living in the United States now under refugee protection, his past buried the way the Pentagon always buried inconvenient truths. He woke during examination. Groggy at first, disoriented by drugs and trauma. Then his eyes found her and recognition flared like a detonation. He began shouting in Pashto. Agitated. Pointing. The words came fast, language that had nothing to do with his injuries and everything to do with memory. Staff froze. They didn't understand. No one in Oak Creek Memorial understood Pashto. Someone called for a translator. The translator arrived 5 minutes later. A young woman who worked part-time in the ER, who'd emigrated from Afghanistan 15 years ago. She listened to Rashid Khan speaking, and her face went pale. What's he saying? Sterling demanded. He'd arrived in the trauma bay, drawn by the commotion, drawn by anything that might give him ammunition. The translator looked at Margaret. Her voice was barely audible. He says that woman killed 6 of his men. He says she carried wounded soldiers through mountains for 2 days. He says she is a warrior, not a nurse. The ER went silent. Complete. Total. The kind of silence that comes when everyone understands something has shifted beneath them. Every eye turned to Margaret, who stood frozen, her borrowed scrub suddenly feeling like a costume, her carefully constructed life detonating in real time with witnesses. Then a new voice cut through the silence. Young. Tight. Controlled. The voice of someone trained in crisis who was barely controlling something beneath the surface. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Margaret's head turned. Her son stood in the trauma bay entrance. Captain James Walsh, United States Marine Corps. He'd driven 7 hours from Camp Lejeune when he heard about the suspension. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a navy hoodie, but he moved with the particular precision of someone trained to kill, trained to lead, trained to understand that some things required witness. Their eyes met. His jaw was set. His hands were loose at his sides. He was looking at his mother the way a soldier looks at a fallen comrade, with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She opened the temporary locker assigned to her. She reached inside the lining of her borrowed jacket and found it there, still sewn into the fabric where she'd hidden it the day her new identity began. The faded unit patch. 3rd Special Forces Group. Forward Surgical Team. The emblem of the life she wasn't supposed to have anymore. She held it in her palm. She didn't speak. A nurse who'd served as an army medic in a previous life stepped forward. She took the patch from Margaret's hand, examined it, and her voice shook. This is an operator patch. Forward Surgical Team. She looked up at Margaret. Her eyes filled. Who are you? Then the sound came from outside. The rotor wash of a helicopter landing on the roof helipad. The distinctive percussion of military rotors cutting air. Everyone in the trauma bay heard it. Everyone understood that sound meant something official had arrived. 30 seconds later, boots on tile. Precise. Synchronized. 4 of them, moving down the corridor with the kind of practiced coordination that came from 1,000 entries into hostile buildings. The doors to the trauma bay opened. A Navy SEAL commander in dress uniform stood in the doorway. His uniform was decorated with ribbons that climbed his chest, a career of classified operations distilled into color-coded authorization. He surveyed the room with the kind of calm that came from understanding that he held authority here that superseded everything else. His eyes found Margaret. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, he said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. 3rd Special Forces Group. Combat Surgical Unit. The staff reacted. Gasps. Murmurs. Disbelief. Dr. Sterling stepped forward, his face flushing with something that wasn't anger, it was fear. This is absurd. She's a civilian nurse with. The commander cut him off without looking at him. His eyes never left Margaret. You're done talking, Doctor. Sterling closed his mouth. The commander opened a file folder stamped with red classification markings. He looked at the ER staff. 2 silver stars, he said. His voice carried the weight of official record. 1st Silver Star for performing field surgery under fire while defending forward operating base warrior in Helmand Province. She was wounded. She continued working. She saved 11 lives. A nurse near the trauma bay wall began to cry. 2nd Silver Star for leading a tactical extraction of 3 pinned-down Marines. She neutralized enemy combatants while under sustained fire. She provided emergency trauma care for 72 consecutive hours during a siege. She extracted the wounded from a building that was collapsing from incoming mortar fire. The ranger medic who'd asked Margaret where she served, the one whose question had started this chain of events, stood at attention. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were locked forward. Bronze Star with Valor, the commander continued. Purple Heart. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V. He paused. The silence was deliberate. Codename, Shepherd. During a night extraction near Kandahar in 2017, Senior Chief Walsh carried 6 wounded personnel through hostile territory for 48 hours with a fractured femur and a 7.62mm round lodged in her right shoulder. She talked down armed combatants in 3 languages. She held a dying SEAL in her arms while calling in air support. Margaret's son moved to her side. His hand rested on her shoulder. He was still looking forward. But his hand was there. Her husband, the commander said, and his voice dropped 1 register, was Lieutenant Commander David Walsh. Navy SEAL. He was killed during a Black Ops extraction in 2018. The mission was buried. Senior Chief Walsh was ordered to disappear because of the operational security classification of what she'd witnessed. The commander closed the file. Officially, Margaret Walsh died in Helmand Province. She was given a new identity. She was told to get a civilian job and live a normal life and never, ever surface. The woman you've been working with is a ghost. The Navy created her. The Navy buried her. And the Navy is extremely disappointed in anyone who harmed her. His eyes moved to Dr. Sterling for the first time. Sterling's face had drained of all color. His mouth was open. He looked the way people look when they understand that they've made a mistake that cannot be unmade, that they've struck at something that had armor beneath the surface, that they've declared war on the wrong person. 2 days after Margaret's suspension, the ER overhead crackled with a code that pulled everyone forward at once. Critical trauma. Motor vehicle collision en route for 60 ETA for minutes. The staff scattered into preparation mode, trauma bay doors opening, equipment rolling into position, the controlled chaos of a hospital bracing for impact. Margaret was at home. She'd spent 36 hours in her kitchen, watching rain streak the windows, the faded unit patch still hidden in her locker at Oak Creek Memorial. Her phone sat on the counter. She wasn't supposed to answer it. She wasn't supposed to come in. The suspension was explicit, documented, sealed in an envelope with a termination date pending the investigation. The phone rang at 3:48 p.m. "We need bodies," the charge nurse said without preamble. "Overflow assistance. Don't care if you're suspended. Come in." Margaret was in her car in 90 seconds. The ER was already running on fumes when she arrived. 2 traumas simultaneously, a dump truck that had T-boned a sedan, passengers ejected, multiple fractures, 1 unconscious driver being wheeled past the triage desk as Margaret moved through the automatic doors. Nobody acknowledged her presence. They didn't have time for protocol violations. She grabbed gloves from the wall dispenser. Moved into Trauma Bay 3 without asking permission. The unconscious patient was a male, mid-40s, severe head trauma, blood matting his dark hair, abdominal distension suggesting internal bleeding. The attending physician was someone she'd never seen before, locum coverage, rotating through, had no idea she was suspended. Pressure dropping, the respiratory therapist called. 82 over 50 and falling. "We're losing him." Margaret read the monitor. The patient's abdomen was rigid. Intra-abdominal hemorrhage. They needed vascular surgery upstairs in 12 minutes or this man was dead. She'd performed field surgery in Helmand Province with less information and a much higher mortality rate. Her hands moved on their own, positioning, assessing, calling out the next step before anyone asked for it. 14-gauge angiocath, 2 large bore 4s, push 0.5 milligrams epinephrine, she said, her voice dropping into the register that made people listen. Not a question. Not a request. The nurses moved. The locum doctor glanced at her, noting her presence, deciding in that split second whether to challenge the authority in her tone or trust the competence in her hands. He chose correctly. He stepped back. Margaret was already moving into position, accessing the left femoral vein, her fingers finding the artery like a pilot finding an instrument in the dark. 23 years. Her hands remembered everything. 02 sat climbing. 72, 81. 89, stable, the tech reported. The patient's eyes fluttered. That's when recognition bloomed across his face like a wound opening. His mouth moved. No sound at first. Then words in rapid Pashto, guttural and furious, his hands reaching toward Margaret even as the nurses held him down. His voice rose, shouting, raw with something between rage and terror, the expression of someone looking at a ghost that had worn his nightmares. A translator arrived from somewhere in the hospital, a Dari speaker named Hassan who'd worked with the military for years. He listened to the patient's words, his face growing pale, then turned to Margaret. He says, Hassan translated slowly, that woman. She is the one who killed 6 of his men. She carried her wounded through the mountains for 2 days. Hassan paused, choosing words carefully. He says she is the reason he was captured. That she is a warrior. That he did not expect to see her again in this life. Margaret didn't move. Didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the fall line. One measured breath. The patient's eyes locked on hers, and she watched him understand, truly understand, that his nightmare had become real, that the ghost of Helmand Province was standing across from him in an American hospital, and that she had just saved his life. Get him upstairs, Margaret said to the attending, her voice level. Vascular's been paged. He's stable enough for transport. The patient was wheeled toward the elevator, still staring at her, his Pashto fading as morphine finally released him into something like mercy. Margaret stripped off her gloves. Turned back to wash her hands. The attending was watching her with an expression somewhere between confusion and the beginning of understanding. That's when the ER doors opened. A Marine Corps captain in dress blue stood in the threshold, and Margaret's chest clenched because she knew that face, the slope of his jaw, the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the way he moved with the economy of someone trained for precision. Her son. James. Older now, the captain's bars on his collar, the weight of command visible in the set of his shoulders, but unmistakably hers. He crossed the ER in 6 strides. His eyes found her across the controlled chaos of monitors and medication carts and fluorescent light that made everything look hollow. Senior Chief Petty Officer, he said quietly, and the words landed like a salute. Margaret's hands trembled, not from fear, not from emotion, but from the seismic shift of something fundamental cracking open. She walked to her locker without speaking. Opened it. Reached for the jacket she'd worn for 3 years, the one she'd hung in the back corner because it was the only place that would let her keep what she needed to keep. Her fingers found the seam where she'd sewn the patch inside the lining, the faded insignia of her Special Forces unit, the symbol of a life that had supposedly ended in Helmand Province. She pulled the patch free. The stitching tore. She held it in her palm like evidence. The charge nurse had stopped working. 2 residents stepped back from the medication station. Hassan the translator was staring. The locum attending doctor looked between Margaret and James and the patch, trying to assemble the equation. Then the ER doors opened again. The man who entered wore the dress whites of a Navy SEAL commander, his bearing precise and authoritative, his eyes sweeping the room with the calm of someone accustomed to rooms doing exactly what he required them to do. Behind him came another officer, this one with the shoulder boards of a rear admiral, the man's face carved from something harder than age, his gaze landing on Margaret with the weight of recognition. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, the SEAL commander said, and his voice carried the weight of ceremony. I have declassified records of your service. 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. 2nd Purple heart. Each medal got its own moment, its own beat, letting the word settle into the fluorescent silence like stones into water. And a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire during Operation Enduring Freedom, Helmand Province, 2017. The ER didn't just go quiet. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. You extracted a team of 8 operators from a compromised position under sustained small arms and RPG fire. You provided emergency trauma surgery in a mountain cave without anesthesia. You carried 2 wounded SEALs through 12 kilometers of hostile territory without support and without stopping. Your performance in that operation saved 6 lives that would have been lost. The SEAL commander paused. Let the room absorb the weight of what those words meant. You were classified as deceased to protect your extraction and your subsequent civilian identity. The terms of your cover were absolute: no disclosure, no contact with military personnel, no indication of your service. You honored those terms for 7 years until your training and instinct required you to save a life here, in this hospital, in ways that a civilian nurse could not have performed. Margaret's son stepped closer. His hand rested on her shoulder. The investigation into your background was terminated as of 6 hours ago, the SEAL commander continued. Your suspension is rescinded. Your civilian cover is no longer necessary. And you are cleared to resume full clinical duties effective immediately. The locum attending still hadn't moved. Hassan was translating quietly to another staff member, his words carrying the weight of something sacred being explained in real time. Then the rear admiral stepped forward. He was tall enough that he seemed to bend the light around him, and his voice when he spoke was pitched low enough that people leaned in to hear. Dr. Sterling, he said, not looking around the room, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance. You initiated a federal investigation into a protected operator's cover identity. You harassed a decorated war hero. You weaponized institutional authority against someone who has sacrificed more for this country than you will comprehend in your remaining lifetime. The admiral's eye swept across the ER, finding the doorway where Sterling was standing. He'd been watching from the staff corridor, his face draining of color as he understood what was happening. You're done, Doctor, the admiral said. Security is escorting you from this building. Your hospital privileges are terminated. Your medical license will be referred to the State Board for investigation into gross professional misconduct. And I am personally filing a federal complaint regarding your interference with classified personnel. Sterling's voice rose, desperate. You can't do this. My family built, my board, I have contracts. Your board voted to terminate you an hour ago, the admiral interrupted. Once they understood that you'd compromised a federal protection arrangement. And they understood it because I called them. Each one. And explained what happens to hospital administrators who enable the harassment of decorated service members. The admiral turned to look directly at Sterling now. You are alone, Doctor. Completely alone. And you will leave this hospital in the next 60 seconds, or I will have federal investigators auditing every corner of this facility before sunrise. Security moved. Their presence was like gravity. Sterling couldn't resist it, could only follow as they guided him toward the exit. He looked back at Margaret once, his face a map of rage and shame and the beginning of understanding that he'd made an enemy of the wrong person. Margaret watched him go without expression. The rear admiral approached her directly. Up close, she could see the medals on his chest, a career spent at the highest level of Special Operations Command. His eyes held hers. Senior Chief, welcome back, he said. Your record is restored. Your service is acknowledged. And I think this hospital's ER is about to get a lot more competent. He paused. For what it's worth, thank you. We lost good people in those mountains. You brought some of them home. Margaret nodded. Her son squeezed her shoulder. The admiral saluted, a formal, precise gesture that seemed to make the fluorescent lights themselves stand taller. The ER staff watched. The realization was spreading through them like oxygen returning to a room that had been holding its breath. The quiet nurse they'd ignored for 3 years. The woman they'd seen absorb insults without speaking. The healer who moved with precision they couldn't explain. She'd been a senior chief petty officer. A decorated warrior. A ghost that had been buried and then had the audacity to stand among them anyway. Hassan approached Margaret quietly. The man upstairs, he said in his careful English. The one who recognized you. He wants you to know, he says thank you. He says he is alive because of you. Both times. Margaret didn't respond with words. She picked up fresh gloves. We have a trauma patient incoming in 3 minutes, she said to the ER. And another one already in the bay upstairs. Let's move. She was already walking. Her son followed. The staff moved with her, not because they had to, but because they understood now that they were working alongside someone whose competence wasn't luck or intuition. It was earned through 7 years of training, through operations they would never hear about, through a sacrifice that had cost her everything and she had carried anyway. By dawn, she was still there. 2 more traumas had come through. A pediatric drowning victim who didn't respond to standard protocols until Margaret suggested an alternative approach that pulled the child back from the edge. An elderly woman with a cardiac event that everyone had written off until Margaret read the monitor differently and ordered labs that changed everything. When her shift ended, Margaret walked out of Oak Creek Memorial into the pale light of a Norfolk morning. The unit patch was visible on her shoulder now, no longer hidden. Her son was waiting by her car. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood there while she breathed in the salt air from the harbor and understood, finally, that she didn't have to be invisible anymore. Behind them, in the ER, the staff was whispering about the woman who'd been among them all along. The warrior healer. The one who'd carried her wounded through mountains they couldn't imagine, through fire they couldn't comprehend, and then had spent 3 years pushing medicine carts and absorbing humiliation because that was what the mission required. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.